The ping came in at 11:47 p.m., and I almost didn't take it. My back ached from 9 hours behind the wheel. My eyes burned from staring through a rain-smeared windshield. And I'd already promised myself the next ride would be my last. The pickup was 14 minutes away, deep in the warehouse district south of Kensington, a part of the city I actively avoided after dark. But the surge pricing had kicked to 3.2 times, and I was $38 short of making rent. So I tapped accept, merged onto the slick overpass, and drove toward the end of everything I'd ever known. My name is Marcus Dunn. I was 31 years old, divorced 8 months, and sleeping in the back of a leased Hyundai Sonata 4 nights a week because the studio apartment I could barely afford had black mold climbing the bathroom walls. Driving rideshare wasn't the plan. I'd been a radiology technician at St. Clement's Memorial for 6 years before the hospital restructured, and my entire department got absorbed by an AI-assisted imaging contract. They gave me a pamphlet about retraining opportunities and a cardboard box for my desk. That was March. By August, I was downloading the Uber driver app in a Wendy's parking lot at 2 in the morning, trying not to think about the fact that my ex-wife, Dana, was already engaged to someone who owned property. The point is, I wasn't a hero. I wasn't a survivalist. I didn't have a go bag in my trunk or a basement full of canned goods. I had a phone charger, a half-empty bottle of Tums, and a Costco pack of water bottles in the back seat. When civilization collapsed, I was the last person who should have made it through. But I did, and a lot of better people didn't. And that's something I'll carry in my chest like a stone for as long as whatever's left of this world keeps turning. The route took me down Archer Boulevard, past the old meatpacking plants that had been converted into loft spaces nobody could afford, then deeper into blocks where the streetlights worked every third pole. I noticed the ambulance first. It was parked diagonally across the mouth of Holt Street, light cycling but no siren, back doors hanging open, no paramedics in sight. I slowed, craning my neck. But the rain made it impossible to see much beyond the amber and red reflections pooling on asphalt. I didn't think about it too hard. This neighborhood had its own rhythms, its own emergencies that resolved or didn't without anyone from my world ever noticing. The pickup pin sat outside a corrugated steel building with no signage, some kind of converted industrial space with a single buzzing floodlight above a loading dock. The passenger's name on the app read, N. Vasquez. Rating, 4.91. The note said, "Please hurry." Passengers wrote that sort of thing all the time. It never meant anything urgent. It meant they were impatient or cold or didn't want to miss a flight. But standing there in the rain, illuminated by my headlights, Nina Vasquez did not look impatient. She looked terrified. She was mid-20s, dark hair plastered to her face, wearing a lab coat over scrubs that were streaked with something I initially mistook for rust. She had a messenger bag clutched against her chest like a shield, and she was looking over her shoulder every 2 seconds, scanning the darkness behind the building with the frantic precision of someone expecting pursuit. She climbed into the back seat before I'd come to a full stop, slammed the door hard enough to rock the car, and said one word. Drive. I pulled away from the curb. In the rear-view mirror, her face was pale and sheened with sweat that had nothing to do with the rain. Her pupils were dilated wide. She was pressing herself into the far corner of the seat, and I could hear her breathing. Shallow, rapid, controlled in the way of someone actively fighting panic. The messenger bag sat in her lap, and her fingers were white-knuckled around the strap. I glanced at the destination on my phone. St. Clement's Memorial Hospital, my old workplace. "Everything okay?" I asked, the way drivers ask, not really wanting the answer. She met my eyes in the mirror. How fast can you get there? I told her 20 minutes with traffic, maybe 15 if the construction on Belmont had cleared. She shook her head like the answer physically hurt her. Her right hand went to her coat pocket and came out with a phone. She dialed, waited, dialed again. Whoever she was calling wasn't picking up. On the third attempt, she whispered something in Spanish that sounded like a prayer, then shoved the phone back into her pocket and pressed her forehead against the window. I've driven thousands of passengers. I've learned to read the silence. There's the comfortable quiet of someone scrolling their phone after a long day. There's the tense silence of a couple who just had a fight. There's the drunk silence, the sad silence, the exhausted silence. Nina Vasquez's silence was none of these. Hers was the silence of a person holding something inside that was too large and too dangerous to release in the confined space of a stranger's car. We were on Archer Boulevard heading north when I heard the first cough. It came from behind me and to the right. Not from Nina, but from the other side of the back seat. I looked in the mirror. There was no one else in the car. Then Nina coughed again, and I realized I'd misjudged the direction. But it didn't sound like a normal cough. It was wet, deep, and had a rattling undertone, like something thick was shifting in her lungs. "You need me to crack a window?" I offered. "No." She wiped her mouth with the back of her hand. In the passing glow of a streetlight, I saw the smear she left across her skin. Dark. Too dark to be saliva. She saw me looking and pulled her sleeve down over her hand. "I'm fine. Just drive." I drove. The rain intensified, hammering the roof in rolling waves. My wipers couldn't keep pace. Through the wash of water, I caught fragments of the city, a gas station with its lights off, a bus stop where no one waited, a police cruiser parked at an intersection with its doors open and dome light on, but no officers visible. That last one nagged at me. Cops didn't leave cruisers open and unattended, but the surge fare glowed on my phone screen, and Nina Vasquez was paying me to get her to street. Clements, not to investigate empty patrol cars. She coughed again at the 6-minute mark, and this time the sound had changed. It was thicker, more convulsive, and it went on for nearly 30 seconds. When it stopped, her breathing had a new quality, a faint whistle on the inhale, like air being drawn through a narrowing passage. I adjusted the mirror to get a better look at her. She had the messenger bag open now, and she was rummaging inside it with trembling hands. She pulled out a small glass vial, uncapped it, and drank the contents in one swallow. Her face contorted. Whatever it wasn't pleasant. "Do you need me to call someone?" I asked. "Paramedics, maybe?" "No paramedics." Her voice had dropped to a register that was almost hoarse. "They won't know what to do with this. Nobody will, except maybe Oren. If Oren's still there." "Oren?" "Dr. Oren Cabrera, infectious disease. He was supposed to meet me an hour ago, but he stopped answering." She looked at me in the mirror, and for the first time, I saw something beyond fear in her eyes. I saw guilt. "I need you to understand something, Marcus." She'd used my name. Passengers could see it on the app. It still jarred me, the sudden intimacy of it. I was exposed to something tonight. In my lab. I'm taking precautions, and I believe the prophylactic I just administered will slow the progression. But I need to be honest with you, because you deserve to know the risk. The car felt smaller. The rain felt louder. I became acutely aware of the recycled air flowing through the vents, the shared atmosphere of the sealed cabin. My foot eased off the accelerator without conscious decision. "What kind of exposure?" She closed her eyes. "The kind that's going to change everything." I should have pulled over. I should have gotten out of the car, stood in the rain, and called 911. But I didn't, because Nina Vasquez was crying now, silently, with the discipline of someone who'd trained themselves not to make noise when they broke. And because some part of me understood that pulling over meant leaving her alone on a dark street in a neighborhood where the ambulances parked with their doors open and nobody inside. I pressed the accelerator and drove faster toward St. Clement's, toward Orin Cabrera, toward answers I wasn't ready for. The dashboard clock read 11:58 p.m. In 2 minutes, it would be Thursday. By Friday, there wouldn't be anyone left to count the days. We hit the first roadblock at the intersection of Belmont and Crane. 2 fire trucks parked nose to nose across all 4 lanes, unmanned, their emergency lights painting the surrounding buildings in alternating red pulses. A sawhorse barricade stretched between them, with a hand-lettered sign that read, "Detour," in spray paint. No arrows, no direction. Just the word, like a command from a god who didn't care where you went as long as you didn't go here. I stopped the car. Nina leaned forward between the seats, staring through the windshield at the barricade. In the red light, her face looked feverish, and I noticed a thin sheen of perspiration along her hairline that hadn't been there before. The prophylactic she'd taken was either working slowly or not working at all. "Go around," she said. "Take Morrow to 5th, then cut through the hospital district from the east." I knew the route. It added 8 minutes, but it was viable. I reversed, swung left onto a side street, and navigated through a residential block where every house was dark. Not sleeping dark, abandoned dark. The difference is in the details. Porch lights left on with no one home, a front door standing 6 inches ajar, a garden hose still running across a lawn, water pooling in the gutter. I counted 3 houses with open doors in a single block. Nina saw them too. She said nothing, but her hand went back to the messenger bag and gripped it tighter. "What's in the bag?" I asked. "Data, samples, everything I pulled from the lab before I left." She paused. "Everything that proves what was done." "What was done by who?" "Meridian Biologics, my employer, or former employer, I suppose, given that I just committed about 14 felonies stealing proprietary research materials." She attempted a laugh that collapsed into another cough, this one brief but sharp. "They were running a modified gain-of-function program on a parasitic fungal organism, cordyceps adjacent but engineered for mammalian neural compatibility. The project was called Latchkey." I understood maybe a third of what she said, but the words parasitic, fungal, and neural arranged themselves in my mind with the clarity of a warning siren. I'd seen enough nature documentaries. I knew what cordyceps did to ants. "You're telling me someone engineered a version of that for people?" "Not for people, on people. There's a difference that matters legally but not morally." She wiped her mouth again. The smear was darker now. "The organism was supposed to be non-viable outside laboratory conditions, temperature-sensitive, oxygen-dependent, with a reproductive cycle that required specific chemical triggers to activate. It was controllable. That was the entire selling point to the Department of Defense. A controllable biological compliance agent." "Compliance agent? A weapon, Marcus. A weapon you could aim." The rain let up slightly as we turned onto Morrow Street, and in the relative clarity, I saw the first body. It was lying face down on the sidewalk near a bus bench, one arm extended as if reaching for something. I slowed instinctively, scanning for signs of life. There were none. What there was, visible even from 20 feet away through a rain-spotted window, was a growth pattern along the back of the person's neck and scalp. Pale, filamentous, branching like frost on glass, but 3-dimensional. rising half an inch from the skin. It looked organic. It looked alive. It looked like it was still spreading. Nina pressed her hand against the window. Oh God, it's already airborne. What do you mean already? The containment breach at the lab was 6 hours ago. 6 hours. The dispersal model said it would take 48 to 72 hours to reach atmospheric saturation in a metro area. This isn't possible at this rate unless... She stopped. Her face went through a sequence of expressions I couldn't fully track, ending on something hollow. Unless the release wasn't accidental. I pulled my shirt up over my nose, a pathetic instinct that probably did nothing. Nina shook her head at the gesture. If it's airborne at this concentration, a cotton shirt won't help. The spores are submicron. They pass through standard filtration like water through a net. Then we're both already exposed. Probably. But exposure is an infection. The organism needs a host with a compromised immune response or an elevated cortisol profile to establish colonization. Stress, exhaustion, injury. Those are the doorways. I almost laughed. Stress and exhaustion. She'd just described every rideshare driver in the city. She'd described me, specifically, running on 5 hours of sleep and gas station coffee and the low-grade anxiety of financial ruin. If this thing was looking for a stressed-out, run-down host, I was a welcome mat. We passed 2 more bodies before reaching 5th Street. St. Clement's Memorial Hospital emerged from the rain like a shipwreck. Massive, familiar, and wrong. I'd spent 6 years walking through those automatic doors, badging into the radiology wing, eating mediocre cafeteria pasta on my breaks. I knew the building the way you know a place that shaped your daily life. And I knew, the moment we pulled into the east lot, that something fundamental had shifted inside it. Half the windows on the 3rd floor were dark. The emergency department entrance, which should have been a river of ambulances and triage chaos, had only 2 vehicles, one of them on the sidewalk, with its front end buried in a concrete bollard. The automatic doors were open, but the lights beyond them flickered in an arrhythmic pattern that suggested the backup generators were cycling under strain. Nina was out of the car before I'd killed the engine. She staggered slightly on landing. Her coordination was degrading, and she caught herself on the doorframe with a sharp intake of breath. I came around to her side and offered my arm. She took it without hesitation, which told me more about her condition than any symptom. People don't accept help from strangers unless the alternative is falling. Infectious disease is on the 4th floor, she said. Oren's lab is 4 East, room 412. If he's anywhere in this building, that's where he'll be. And if he's not, then we use whatever equipment he has to synthesize more of the prophylactic, and we buy time. We entered through the emergency department, and the smell hit me first. Antiseptic layered over something organic and sweet, like overripe fruit left in a warm room. The triage area was empty. Not cleared out empty, but interrupted empty, as if everyone had stood up mid-task and walked away. Clipboards on the floor, a wheelchair overturned near the vending machines. A coffee cup on the nurse's station, still steaming. The television mounted in the waiting area was tuned to a local news channel, but the broadcast had been replaced by the emergency alert screen. That stark blue background with scrolling white text I'd only ever seen during tornado warnings. Shelter in place. Avoid contact with symptomatic individuals. Do not attempt to travel. Await further instruction. The text repeated on an endless loop. No voiceover, no anchor. Just the silent scroll of words that told you everything and nothing. Nina moved with surprising purpose for someone whose body was actively being colonized by an engineered parasitic organism. She led me past the triage desk, through a set of double doors marked "Authorized Personnel Only," and into the main corridor of the first floor. Here, the evidence of departure was more chaotic. Gurneys shoved against walls at odd angles. IV stands toppled. A trail of dark fluid, I refused to call it what it obviously was, leading from an exam room to the stairwell door, which stood open. From somewhere above us, maybe the second or third floor, came a sound I'd never heard before and have never been able to adequately describe since. It was rhythmic, wet, and layered, like dozens of people chewing with their mouths open in imperfect unison. It rose and fell in waves, and it echoed down the stairwell with a resonance that made the concrete walls seem to pulse. Nina froze. Her grip on my arm became a vice. "They're clustered," she whispered. "The organism drives them to aggregate once colonization reaches the motor cortex. They cluster for warmth and spore exchange. If there's a group above us, we need the service elevator. We found it at the end of the east corridor. A freight elevator used for transporting beds and equipment between floors." I hit the call button, and the machinery groaned to life above us, ancient and slow. While we waited, Nina leaned against the wall and closed her eyes. Under the fluorescent lights, I could see the changes more clearly now. The veins in her temples had darkened, visible through her skin like river tributaries on a map. A fine tremor ran through her hands. Her lips had taken on a bluish tint that had nothing to do with cold. "How long do you have?" I asked. She opened her eyes. "Before what?" "Before you become one of them." The elevator arrived with a mechanical groan. The doors parted. Inside, slumped in the far corner, was a hospital security guard. His name tag read, Powell. His eyes were open, glassy, fixed on nothing. The fungal growth covered the entire right side of his face, pale tendrils threading into his ear canal and across his closed eyelid. His chest rose and fell in a rhythm too slow to be normal breathing. He wasn't dead. He wasn't alive in any way that mattered either. Nina pulled me back from the elevator doors with a strength that contradicted her deteriorating state. We stood in the corridor, staring at the thing that had been Officer Powell. And for 3 full seconds, neither of us breathed. His head turned, not toward us, toward something only he could sense, some signal in the air or vibration in the floor that registered on whatever remained of his nervous system. The tendrils on his face rippled, a slow undulation like seagrass in a current, and a fine powder drifted from the tips. Spores released in a visible cloud that hung in the elevator's stale air like dust in a sunbeam. "Stairs," Nina said. "We take the stairs." "You said there's a cluster in the stairwell." "The west stairwell. We'll use the east." We backtracked through the corridor, past radiology, my old department, the door propped open with a rubber wedge, the darkened imaging rooms beyond it like empty theaters, and found the east stairwell entrance. Nina pressed her ear to the door and listened. Silence. She nodded, and I pushed through. The stairwell was cold, colder than it should have been, and I realized someone had opened the roof access door 4 flights up. Rain and wind funneled down through the concrete shaft, and the temperature drop felt almost merciful against the fever heat of the hospital's interior. We climbed. Nina managed the first flight on her own, but by the second floor landing, she was gripping the railing with both hands and pulling herself upward like the stairs were a cliff face. I put my arm around her waist and took her weight. She didn't protest. The guilt was still in her eyes, permanent now, like a stain that had set. I helped build it, she said between breaths. Latchkey. I was on the neural interface team. We designed the binding proteins that allow the organism to integrate with the host's motor functions. Each word cost her visibly. I told myself it was theoretical, proof of concept, the kind of research that gets published and debated and never leaves the lab. I was 23 when they recruited me. I wanted to matter. You're 25 now, and the world is ending. So let's table the confession and keep climbing. She managed something like a smile. Fair. We reached the 4th floor landing. The door to 4 East was locked, which was actually the first reassuring sign I'd encountered all night. Locked meant someone had deliberately secured it. Locked meant someone was still thinking clearly enough to want to keep things out. I knocked. 3 sharp raps that echoed through the stairwell, and waited. 10 seconds, 20. I was raising my fist to knock again when a voice came through the door, muffled but precise. Who's there? How many? 2, I said. One of us is looking for Dr. Oren Cabrera. A pause. Then, who's looking? Nina leaned toward the door. Oren, it's Nina. Open the door. I have the latchkey files. The silence that followed lasted long enough for me to consider the possibility that we'd been wrong. That whoever was behind this door wasn't Oren at all. That we'd just announced ourselves and the valuable thing we carried to a stranger. Then a deadbolt turned. Then a second one. The door opened 6 inches, held by a chain, and a face appeared in the gap. Male, mid-50s, South Asian features, wire-frame glasses, deeply exhausted. He looked at Nina, then at me, then back at Nina. His expression fractured. Your eyes, he said. Nina, you're sclera. I know. I self-administered the CR7 compound 40 minutes ago. It's slowing but not stopping. Oren, I need your lab. I need it now. He unlatched the chain and pulled the door wide. The 4th floor corridor beyond was lit by battery-powered lanterns placed at intervals on the floor, casting warm pools of amber light that made the institutional hallway feel almost intimate. Oren Cabrera was tall, thin, wearing a wrinkled dress shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows and a surgical mask hanging loose around his neck. He moved like a man who hadn't slept in days, but whose mind refused to shut down. Who is he? Oren asked, nodding toward me. My driver, Nina said. He can't stay. He's already been exposed. Oren looked at me the way an oncologist looks at a scan. Clinical, searching, not unkind. How do you feel? Scared, I said, but functional. That's something. He turned and started down the corridor. Both of you come and don't touch anything. Oren's lab was a converted patient room at the end of the 4 East wing, crammed with equipment that hadn't been here when this was a functioning hospital floor. Centrifuges, microscopes, a portable biosafety cabinet that hummed like a small refrigerator, laptops trailing cables to external hard drives. The window overlooked the east parking lot, and through it, I could see my Hyundai Sonata 4 stories below, already looking like an artifact from a dead civilization. Oren had clearly been working here for days before tonight. The trash can overflowed with energy bar wrappers and empty water bottles. A sleeping bag was wadded in the corner next to a pillow with no case. I've been monitoring the situation since Tuesday, Oren said, pulling a stool to the biosafety cabinet and gesturing for Nina to sit. The first cases came through the ED 72 hours ago. 3 patients presenting with rapid onset fungal colonization of the upper respiratory tract and escalating neurological symptoms. By the time I got a tissue sample under a microscope, I knew what I was looking at. He looked at Nina. I knew it was latchkey. That's why you called me, Nina said. I called you because you're the only person who left Meridian with enough institutional knowledge to help me understand the replication cycle. And because I believed you were the only person on that project with a conscience. He snapped on nitrile gloves. Show me the samples. Nina opened the messenger bag and began laying items on the bench with the careful reverence of someone handling holy relics. Vials of fluid ranging from amber to a deep, unsettling violet. USB drives. Printed documents in sealed plastic bags. A small aluminum case that, when opened, revealed rows of glass slides, each labeled in Nina's precise handwriting with dates and specimen codes. While Oren worked, examining slides, loading samples into the centrifuge, pulling data from the USB drives onto his laptop. I made myself useful the only way I could. I explored the immediate area of the 4th floor, checking doors, testing locks, mapping exits. The wing had 12 rooms, most empty, but 3 were occupied. In room 406, a woman sat on the edge of a hospital bed, staring at the wall. She was mid-40s, heavy-set, wearing a nurse's uniform with a name embroidered on the chest. Gloria. She didn't look at me when I appeared in the doorway. Gloria, I'm Marcus. Are you hurt? I was on shift when it started, she said to the wall. In the ED. They came in looking sick, and then they stopped looking sick and started looking like something else. I saw Dr. Frankel try to intubate one of them, and the patient sat up and grabbed his face, grabbed it with both hands, and held on while the growth just spread, right from the patient's palms onto Dr. Frankel's skin, like it was reaching for him. She turned her head slowly. Her eyes were red from crying, but clear. No darkened veins, no fungal threads. She was clean. I ran, she said. I left him there, and I ran. You survived. That matters. Does it? I didn't have an answer that would help, so I told her about Oren and Nina, about the lab, about the attempt to understand the organism and find a way to slow it. Gloria listened with the particular stillness of a medical professional assessing a prognosis. When I finished, she stood up, smoothed her uniform, and walked past me into the hallway. Where's the lab? She asked. Room 412. End of the hall. I've got 23 years of clinical nursing experience. If they need hands, I've got hands. In room 409, I found a man and a teenager. The man was sitting on the floor with his back against the wall, and the teenager, a girl, maybe 16, was asleep on the bed with a coat draped over her as a blanket. The man looked up when I entered. He was wiry, alert, with the calloused hands of someone who worked construction or trades. I'm Marcus. Ray Montero. That's my daughter Sophie. We came in because she was having an asthma attack and the ER was the closest option. That was 3 hours ago. The doctor told us to stay put and never came back. He glanced at the sleeping girl. She's breathing fine now. But I can't get anyone on the phone, and the parking lot looks wrong. It is wrong. All of it is wrong. But there are people on this floor who are working on it, and the wing is secured. Ray Montero processed this with the efficiency of a man accustomed to making decisions on incomplete information. What do you need from me? Can you help me secure the stairwell doors? He was on his feet before I finished the sentence. By 2 a.m., we'd formed something that wasn't quite a team, but was more than a collection of strangers. Ray and I barricaded the east stairwell door with a gurney and 2 filing cabinets from the nurse's station. We checked every room on the 4th floor and found them empty. The rest of the staff and patients had either evacuated or migrated to other parts of the building during the initial chaos. Gloria stationed herself in Oren's lab, assisting with sample preparation and monitoring Nina's vitals with the practiced calm of someone who'd spent decades in crisis environments. Oren worked in near silence, speaking only to issue instructions or mutter observations to himself in a mix of English and what I later learned was Tagalog. Nina was getting worse. I could see it from the hallway through the lab's open door. The way she held herself more rigidly with each passing hour, the way her movements were becoming deliberate in a manner that suggested conscious effort to override something, fighting for control of her motor functions. The veins in her hands had darkened to a bruised purple that crept toward her wrists. Twice, I saw her fingers twitch involuntarily. A rapid drumming motion against the bench that she stopped by pressing her palm flat and holding it there with her other hand. She was losing a war with her own body, and she knew the timeline better than anyone. Sophie Montero woke at 2:30 and handled the news of the world's collapse with a surreal composure that seems unique to teenagers. She sat cross-legged on the hospital bed, listened to her father's carefully edited summary of the situation, and asked 2 questions. Is this like a zombie thing? And do we have food? Ray answered yes to both. Yes, it was something like that. And yes, I'd found a vending machine in the break room that we'd pried open with a fire extinguisher. Sophie accepted a bag of pretzels and a Sprite and retreated into her phone, which still had battery but no signal. I stood at the window in the corridor and looked out at the city. From the 4th floor of St. Clement's, you could see a wide swath of the urban grid stretching north toward downtown. What I saw made my stomach drop with the slow certainty of an elevator in freefall. Fires. Not 1 or 2, but dozens, scattered across the skyline like a constellation mapped onto the cityscape. Some were small, a car maybe, or a storefront. Others were massive, throwing columns of black smoke that merged with the low cloud cover and turned the sky into a bruised, flickering ceiling. No sirens. That was the detail that embedded itself in my mind. A city on fire and no sirens. The infrastructure of response had been overwhelmed or abandoned. From the stairwell, muffled by the barricade but unmistakable, came the chewing sound again. The cluster on the 2nd or 3rd floor was still there, still aggregated, still cycling through whatever communal biological process drove them to huddle and exchange spores. I pressed my ear to the barricade and listened. Beneath the wet rhythm, I caught something else. A harmonic, almost tonal, like a low hum produced by vocal cords that no longer served the purpose of speech. It vibrated in my molars. They communicate, Oren said from behind me, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. He'd approached silently, still wearing his gloves, holding a tablet displaying what looked like a waveform analysis. Subsonic vocalization. The colonized organism co-opts the host's laryngeal muscles to produce frequencies below the threshold of normal human hearing. What you're picking up is the upper harmonic, the edge of the signal that bleeds into audible range. What are they saying? It's not language, it's coordination. Think of it like a heartbeat that synchronizes across multiple hosts. The more individuals in a cluster, the stronger the signal, and the wider its range. He adjusted his glasses. I believe the signal serves a secondary function as well. Recruitment. Uncolonized hosts in the early stages of spore exposure may be drawn toward the sound without conscious awareness. A form of biological summoning. I stepped back from the barricade. You're telling me that sound is trying to call us down there? I'm telling you that if any of us are in the early stages of colonization, the impulse to move toward that sound will become progressively harder to resist. We both looked down the corridor toward room 412, where Nina sat under the amber light of a battery lantern, her darkened veins visible even at this distance. How long does she have? I asked. Based on the progression rate? 4 to 6 hours before the organism reaches the motor cortex and voluntary behavior becomes compromised. He turned back toward the lab. I may be able to slow it further, I may not. But the data she brought. Marcus, the data is extraordinary. Meridian documented the entire engineering process. Every protein modification, every binding pathway, every vulnerability they identified and chose to ignore because it would have made the organism less effective as a weapon. Vulnerabilities? He stopped walking and looked at me, and for the first time since I'd met him, something other than exhaustion crossed his face. It was hope, thin and fragile, but real. The organism has a thermal ceiling. Above 39.2 degrees Celsius, the mycelial network destabilizes. It can't maintain neural integration. The colonized hosts would experience something like a system crash. Loss of coordinated motor function, cessation of spore production, potentially irreversible structural damage to the organism itself. So fever kills it? Targeted hyperthermia. Raise the host's core temperature past the threshold and sustain it. The organism dies. The host survives. Theoretically. Theoretically. The word hung between us like a dare. Oren returned to the lab, and I stood in the corridor processing the implications. We had a weapon. Not a gun, not a barricade, but a temperature, a number, 39.2 degrees. The gap between that knowledge and any practical application felt like standing on one side of a canyon and being told the bridge was on the other side. I found Ray in the break room, sitting at a table that still had someone's half-eaten lunch on it. He'd found a facilities map of the hospital in the maintenance closet and had it spread out in front of him, studying it with the focus of a man reading blueprints. The building has a central boiler system, he said, without looking up. Feeds the radiant heating in the floors and the hot water supply for the entire complex. It's in the basement, sub-level 2. Why does that matter? Because your doctor friend just told the nurse that heat kills this thing, and I could hear him from the hallway. Ray tapped the map. The boiler can push water temperature to nearly 90 degrees Celsius. The radiant heating system threads through every floor. If someone could get to the boiler room, override the safety limiters, and max the output, you could turn this building into an oven. I sat down across from him. The basement is 2 floors below the cluster in the stairwell. The service corridors. He traced a line on the map with his finger. Maintenance access runs parallel to the main building on the east side. Separate entrance from the loading dock. Leads to the mechanical room, which connects to the boiler room through a service tunnel. You wouldn't have to go through the main stairwell at all. Have you been down there? No. But I've worked buildings like this. The infrastructure is always the same. Oversized, under-maintained, and designed by someone who assumed a maintenance crew would always be available. He looked up. I can do this, Marcus. Boilers and pipe systems. That's my trade. I've been a steam fitter for 19 years. The universe, in its arbitrary cruelty, had placed a steam fitter on the 4th floor of a hospital where the only weapon against an engineered parasitic organism was heat delivered through pipes. I wanted to find meaning in that. I wanted to believe it was providence or fate or some cosmic alignment of skill and necessity. But I'd stopped believing in that kind of narrative coherence around the same time my marriage ended and my career evaporated. What I believed was that Ray Montero was a competent man offering a competent solution, and that the alternative was sitting on the 4th floor, waiting for Nina to turn and the cluster below us to grow. You can't go alone, I said. I know. He folded the map. Sophie stays here, with Gloria and the doctors. Agreed. We told Oren. He listened, asked 3 technical questions about the radiant heating system's capacity and distribution range, and then performed rapid calculations on his tablet. His conclusion: if the boiler output could be sustained at maximum for approximately 90 minutes. The ambient temperature on every floor of the building would exceed the organism's thermal ceiling. The colonized individuals in the cluster would experience neurological disruption within 20 to 30 minutes. Spore viability in the air would drop to near zero within 45. It won't save anyone already in late-stage colonization, Oren said, glancing toward Nina, who was asleep now, or unconscious, the distinction increasingly unclear. But it would sterilize the building, and it would buy us time to synthesize the prophylactic in sufficient quantities using Nina's data. Gloria raised a practical objection. Ambient temperature above 40 degrees Celsius is dangerous for healthy humans. Prolonged exposure causes heat exhaustion, organ stress, potentially fatal hyperthermia. We monitor ourselves, hydrate aggressively, wet towels, cold water from the taps before the system heats it. We can manage 90 minutes of extreme heat. Oren paused. The alternative is that the cluster grows, the spore concentration increases, and one by one, we join them. Sophie, who had been listening from the doorway of room 409 with the pretzel still in her hand, spoke for the first time since her initial questions. "Dad, be careful." Ray crossed to her and put his hands on her shoulders. He said something low that I couldn't hear, and she nodded, and he kissed the top of her head. It was such an ordinary gesture, a father reassuring a child, that it felt almost obscene in the context of what surrounded us. Ordinary human tenderness persisting at the edge of biological annihilation. I looked away because it was either that or cry. And crying wasn't going to get us to the boiler room. We left at 3:15 a.m. Ray carried the facility's map, a flashlight from the nurse's station, and a fire axe he'd pulled from the emergency case in the corridor. I carried a flashlight, a bottle of water, and the acute awareness that I was a former radiology technician following a steam fitter into the basement of a building infested with fungal zombies, and that nothing in my life had prepared me for any of this. The service corridor entrance was exactly where the map said it would be. The heavy steel door at the east end of the loading dock, secured with a padlock that Ray dispatched with 2 swings of the axe. The corridor beyond was narrow, unfinished concrete, lit by caged utility bulbs spaced too far apart. It smelled like machine oil and stagnant water. We moved in single file, Ray leading, our footsteps echoing off surfaces that hadn't been cleaned in years. Somewhere beneath us, through the concrete and the pipes and the accumulated infrastructure of a building designed to save lives, the boiler waited. The service corridor ran the length of the building's east side, descending gradually through a series of ramps and half flights of stairs designed for dolly access rather than human comfort. The walls were lined with cable trays, conduit bundles, and water pipes of varying diameter, some sweating with condensation, others dry and rust-spotted. Ray moved through the space with the confidence of someone navigating a familiar grammar, reading the pipes the way a musician reads sheet music, identifying flow direction, material, purpose. He touched a 6-inch main with his palm and nodded. Hot water supply. This feeds directly from the boiler. We follow this, we find the mechanical room. We followed it. The pipe led us down a final ramp into a broader space, a junction where the service corridor intersected with the building's main mechanical systems. The ceiling was higher here, festooned with ductwork and electrical conduit. Ray swept his flashlight across the space and found what he was looking for. A double door marked Mechanical Room. Authorized personnel only. It was unlocked. The mechanical room was enormous, a cathedral of infrastructure. The boiler itself dominated the far wall. A Cleaver Brooks fire tube unit, industrial scale, its blue steel casing humming at a low idle. Banks of circulating pumps flanked it, and a control panel with analog gauges and digital readouts occupied the near wall. Ray went straight to the panel and began reading gauges with a speed that bordered on reverence. Systems on standby, low fire, circulating at baseline, 38 degrees water temperature, just enough to keep the pipes from freezing. He opened a panel cover and studied the wiring beneath. The safety limiters are electronic: pressure relief, high temperature cutoff, flame safeguard. To override, I need to bypass the Aquastat controller and manually disable the high limit switch. He looked at me. I can do this. It'll take me about 20 minutes. What do I do? Watch the door. So I watched the door. I stood in the mechanical room of St. Clement's Memorial Hospital at 3:40 a.m. with a flashlight and a bottle of water, guarding the entrance while a man I'd known for 2 hours performed open-heart surgery on a boiler system to save a building full of people from a weapon that was never supposed to leave a laboratory. Behind me, Ray worked with the quiet intensity of someone for whom competence is a form of love. Every wire stripped cleanly, every connection tested, every modification deliberate. He narrated as he went, not for my benefit, but out of professional habit, the way surgeons talk through procedures. Bypassing the Aquastat high limit, jumping the TT terminals to keep the gas valve open regardless of temperature feedback. The pressure relief is mechanical, not electronic, so it'll still function. We won't rupture the tank. But without the high limit, the burner will run continuous until the water temperature hits the relief valve set point, which is... He checked a placard on the boiler casing. 93 degrees Celsius. More than enough. At 3:52 a.m., I heard the sound. Not the chewing, not the subsonic hum. Something different. A single set of footsteps, slow and uneven, echoing from the service corridor we'd used to reach the mechanical room. I clicked off my flashlight and pressed against the wall beside the door. The footsteps grew closer. They had an irregular cadence. Step, drag, that suggested damaged motor function or injury. Through the gap between the double doors, I saw a shadow pass through the junction outside. It stopped. I held my breath. The shadow remained motionless. Then I heard the breathing. That wet, whistling inhale that I'd first heard from Nina in the back seat of my car. The colonized individual on the other side of the door was standing still, not moving, not advancing, sensing. I could feel it probing the air, reading the environment through whatever chemical or subsonic apparatus the organism had threaded through its host's nervous system. Ray had stopped working. He stood frozen at the control panel, wrench in hand, watching me. I held up one finger. 1. He nodded. We waited. 30 seconds. A minute. The breathing continued, and then the footsteps resumed. Step, drag, moving away from us, down the corridor toward the west end of the building. The sound faded. I exhaled so hard my vision blurred. Ray turned back to the panel. His hands were shaking, but his voice was steady. 15 more minutes. Those 15 minutes were the longest of my life. Every creak of the pipes was a footstep. Every gust of air through the ductwork was a breath. I stood at that door with every nerve firing, ears straining, muscles tensed to the point of pain. And I understood something about fear that I'd never grasped before. Fear isn't the spike of adrenaline when the danger appears. Fear is the sustained vigilance of waiting for it to appear again, knowing that it will, not knowing when. Fear is a marathon, not a sprint. And most people are only trained for short distances. At 4:08 a.m., Ray stepped back from the control panel and looked at me. It's done. When I throw this switch, the burner goes to high fire and stays there. Water temperature will start climbing immediately. It'll take about 20 minutes for the radiant system to distribute heat to the upper floors. He put his hand on the switch. Once I throw it, we need to get back upstairs fast. It's going to get hot in here first. Do it. He threw the switch. The boiler roared to life. The sound the boiler made when it went to full fire was a deep, resonant ignition that vibrated through the concrete floor and up through my legs into my chest. The gauges on the control panel began climbing, water temperature moving steadily upward from 38 degrees, 42, 46, the needle sweeping right with a mechanical inevitability that felt almost sentient. The circulating pumps engaged at full capacity, and the pipes in the walls and ceiling began to tick and groan as superheated water surged through the building's vascular system. We ran. Not the controlled jog of two men conserving energy, but the flat-out sprint of two men who understood that the temperature in this basement room was about to become hostile to all life, colonized or otherwise. Ray led, flashlight bouncing off the corridor walls, and I followed. The sound of the boiler growing muted behind us as we ascended the service ramps. By the time we reached the loading dock, I could already feel the change. The air in the corridor had taken on a warmth that went beyond ambient, a radiating, penetrating heat that came from the walls themselves, from the floor, from the infrastructure that was now channeling near boiling water through every capillary of the building. We re-entered the main hospital through the east emergency exit and hit the stairwell running. The east stairwell, our stairwell, was still clear, but the temperature was climbing noticeably with every flight. By the second floor, I was sweating through my shirt. By the third, the metal railing was warm to the touch. And from the west side of the building, from the cluster, came a new sound. It started as a disturbance in the chewing rhythm, a syncopation, an offbeat stutter that cascaded through the group. Then it became something else, a collective vocalization. Not the subsonic hum Oren had described, but a higher register, an audible keening that rose in pitch and volume as we climbed. It was the sound of organisms experiencing systemic distress, transmitted through host bodies that still possessed vocal cords. It was anguished and alien, and it scraped across my consciousness like a blade across glass. We reached the fourth floor. The barricade was still in place. I pounded on the door, and Gloria's voice came through immediately. She'd been waiting. "Is it you?" "It's us. We did it. Open up." The barricade shifted. I heard furniture scraping, and the door opened. Gloria's face was flushed, and her scrubs were darkened with sweat. "The temperature's been climbing for 10 minutes. Oren said to expect it, but it's accelerating faster than he projected." The fourth floor corridor was transformed. The battery lanterns still cast their amber light, but the air had thickened with heat, shimmering slightly near the floor where the radiant system was most concentrated. Oren was in the lab, seated beside Nina, monitoring her vitals on a portable pulse oximeter. Nina was awake, barely. Her eyes tracked our entrance, but the movements were sluggish, disconnected, as if the signal between intention and action was being rerouted through damaged circuitry. "Her temperature is already at 38.6 from the infection," Oren said. "The ambient heat will push her past 39.2 within minutes. The organism will experience thermal disruption before she does. And if the heat damages her too, Gloria and I will manage that. We have IV fluids and cold compresses for the critical phase, but the organism must reach thermal ceiling first. That is non-negotiable." The keening from below intensified. Through the floor, I could feel vibrations, movements, the cluster breaking apart as individual hosts staggered away from each other in response to the thermal assault. The aggregation that the organism had driven them toward was dissolving. Bodies in motion, directionless, their coordinating signal degrading as the mycelial networks overheated and began to fragment. I imagined the hallways below us, the second floor, the third, filling with stumbling, disoriented forms, their movements increasingly erratic as the borrowed motor controls stuttered and failed. Ray found Sophie in room 409. She was sitting on the bed with wet towels draped over her shoulders. Gloria's doing, and a bottle of water in her hand. She looked scared but focused. When Ray walked in, she stood up and threw her arms around him, and he held her. And for a moment the keening below and the furnace heat of the air and the impossible circumstances of our existence all receded behind the image of a father holding his daughter on the 4th floor of a dying hospital. I soaked my shirt in the bathroom sink and wrung it over my head. The water was warm. Everything was warm now. But the evaporative effect provided marginal relief. Through the window, the city continued to burn. The fires had spread since I'd last looked, merging in some areas into broader conflagrations that lit the cloud cover from beneath with an orange glow. No helicopters. No emergency broadcasts visible on the distant highway signs. Whatever response infrastructure existed had either been overwhelmed or had simply stopped functioning. In the lab, Nina screamed. It was sudden, sharp, and short, a burst of sound that cut through the heat-thick air and snapped every head in the corridor toward room 412. I ran. Oren was holding Nina's shoulders, and Gloria was pressing a cold pack to the back of her neck. Nina's body was rigid, every muscle locked in contraction, her back arched off the chair. The veins in her neck and face that had darkened throughout the night were now pulsing visibly. And beneath the skin, I could see movement. A writhing, subcutaneous agitation as the mycelial network reacted to the thermal assault. Then she collapsed. Every muscle released simultaneously, and she went limp in Oren's arms like a marionette whose strings had been cut. Her breathing was rapid and shallow. Gloria checked the pulse ox. Heart rate 142, temperature 39.8. She's past the ceiling. Oren leaned close to Nina's face. Nina, can you hear me? Her eyes opened. They were bloodshot, exhausted, and fully human. The darkened veins were already beginning to fade, the bruised purple retreating toward normal like ink dissolving in water. She looked at Oren, then at me, and her lips moved. Did it work? It worked, and it didn't. Within the walls of St. Clement's Memorial Hospital, the organism died. We knew it was dying because the keening stopped. Not gradually. It cut off like a switch being thrown, replaced by a silence that was almost as disturbing. Then came the sounds of collapse. Bodies falling. Not the controlled descent of people sitting or lying down, but the boneless impact of forms whose animating intelligence had been severed. Through the floor, through the walls, through the entire vibrating infrastructure of the building, we heard them drop. Dozens of them. The cluster on the lower floors dismantled in a cascade of thermal failure. Each colonized host experiencing the system crash that Oren had predicted. Loss of coordinated motor function, cessation of spore production, structural collapse of the mycelial network. The organisms died in their hosts like lights going out in a building, floor by floor, room by room. But the hosts, the people, that was the part that didn't work, or didn't work the way we'd hoped. 20 minutes after the thermal peak, Ray and I descended to the 3rd floor to assess the situation, moving through air that was now oppressively hot. I estimated 44 or 45 degrees Celsius, with wet towels around our necks, and the grim anticipation of men approaching a battlefield. The 3rd floor corridor was littered with bodies. 17 by my count, though some were positioned in ways that made individual identification difficult. They lay where they'd fallen when the organism released them, sprawled across floor tiles, slumped against walls, draped over gurneys. The fungal growths that had covered their skin were already changing, the pale filaments darkening to a necrotic brown, wilting, desiccating in the heat. The spore clouds that had filled the air were gone, the particles either destroyed by the temperature or rendered inert. Most of the hosts were dead, not from the heat, but from the colonization itself. The organism, in its occupation of their neural systems, had caused irreversible damage to brain tissue. And when it died, what remained was insufficient to sustain autonomous life. They had been consumed from the inside, hollowed out. And when the thing that had been piloting them ceased to function, there was simply not enough left. But 3 of them were breathing. 3 people out of 17 lay on that corridor floor with chests rising and falling in the slow rhythm of deep unconsciousness. Their fungal growths were dead and peeling. Their skin beneath the residue was pale but intact. Whatever the organism had taken from their neural architecture, it hadn't taken everything. These 3 had been colonized recently enough, or their individual physiology was resistant enough that the thermal purge had killed the organism before it killed them. We couldn't move them. Not safely, not in the heat, not without medical equipment and more hands than we had. Ray marked their locations with bed sheets torn into strips and tied to the nearest fixtures, a triage system improvised from desperation. We moved quickly. The heat was becoming dangerous even for us. My vision was swimming at the edges, and Ray's breathing had taken on a labored quality that concerned me. Back on the 4th floor, Oren received our report with the measured grief of a man who had already calibrated his expectations downward. 3 survivors out of a cluster of 17, a 20% survival rate for late-stage colonization. He wrote the number on his tablet and stared at it. The early-stage prophylactic Nina developed, the CR7 compound, works by blocking the binding proteins that allow the organism to interface with neural tissue. If administered before colonization reaches the central nervous system, it prevents the damage that makes thermal purge lethal to the host. He looked at Nina, who was sitting upright now, drinking water, color returning to her face in uneven patches. Nina survived because she self-administered within the first hour of exposure. If we can produce CR7 in quantity and distribute it alongside a thermal protocol, you're talking about saving people, I said. Out there, in the city. I'm talking about proving that this organism can be defeated and providing the method. The data Nina brought includes the complete synthesis pathway for CR7. Any facility with a basic pharmaceutical lab could produce it. There are no facilities. There's no infrastructure. The city is burning. Then we find what remains. We find whoever is still organized enough to receive this information, and we give it to them. Oren set down his tablet. Marcus, this isn't a cure. It's a protocol. Heat and chemistry. 2 things that human civilization has been capable of deploying for centuries. We don't need advanced technology. We need a boiler and a lab, that's all. Gloria, who had been tending to Nina in silence, spoke from across the room. And we need to get out of this building before the boiler burns through whatever fuel supply it's running on, and this floor becomes uninhabitable. She was right. The temperature was still climbing. My skin felt tight, dry, like standing too close to an open oven. The water in the taps was now too hot to touch. The building that had been our shelter was becoming our threat. We left St. Clement's at 5:20 a.m., just as the first gray light of a dawn none of us had expected to see began to dilute the fire-lit darkness of the eastern sky. 6 of us walked out through the loading dock entrance. Myself, Ray, Sophie, Gloria, Oren, and Nina, who moved under her own power, but slowly, leaning on Gloria's arm the way she'd leaned on mine hours earlier. Oren carried a backpack stuffed with Nina's data, the CR7 synthesis documents, and 3 vials of the compound itself. Everything we needed to prove that the organism could be beaten and to show others how. Ray carried the fire axe and the facilities map, which he'd annotated with the boiler modifications in case the information proved useful elsewhere. Sophie carried 2 bags of vending machine food and every water bottle we'd been able to fill before the taps became scalding. The parking lot was silent. My Hyundai sat where I'd left it, rain-streaked and ordinary, the last artifact of the world I'd driven in from. I unlocked it and started the engine. The tank was at 3/4. I'd filled up at the beginning of my shift, a lifetime ago. Nina and Oren took the back seat. Gloria took the front passenger seat. Ray and Sophie followed in a hospital security vehicle that Ray had found, with keys still in the ignition, its engine turning over on the first try. We drove east, away from the city center, away from the fires and the silence and the bodies on the sidewalks, with their withered fungal crowns. The streets were empty in a way that streets, in a city of 2 million people, should never be empty. No traffic, no pedestrians, no sound, except our engines and the tires on wet pavement. Storefronts were dark. Traffic lights cycled through their colors for an audience of no one. A city on autopilot, running its programs for a population that had either fled or fallen. Nina directed us from the back seat. She knew the metropolitan area's research facilities. Meridian Biologics had partnerships with 3 universities and a federal research campus in the eastern suburbs. If any of those facilities were still operational, they'd have the equipment to synthesize CR7 and the communication infrastructure to disseminate the protocol. Hadley Federal Research Center, she said. 26 miles east on Route 9. It's a CDC-affiliated biosafety facility. If anyone is still coordinating a response, it would be there. Route 9 was a 4-lane highway that cut through increasingly suburban terrain. Strip malls, gas stations, residential developments that gave way to farmland. We drove in convoy, my Hyundai leading and Ray's security vehicle close behind. The road was mostly clear, with occasional obstacles. An abandoned car, a jackknife delivery truck. That required careful navigation, but never fully blocked our path. The colonized were present but sparse. I saw them in the margins, standing motionless in a church parking lot, sitting on the steps of a fire station, wandering a supermarket parking lot in a loose, directionless cluster. The rural dispersal pattern was thinner than the city, the population density insufficient to support the rapid aggregation that Oren had described. Out here, the infected were isolated, disconnected from the subsonic network, reduced to solitary organisms performing degraded versions of the behaviors the parasite had programmed into them. 12 miles out, Oren's phone buzzed. He stared at it as though it were an alien artifact, then answered. The call lasted 4 minutes. I couldn't hear the other end, but I watched Oren's face in the rearview mirror, the way it cycled through surprise, urgency, calculation, and finally, something hard and resolved. That was Dr. Linda Tsao at Hadley, he said when he hung up. The facility is operational. They have a skeleton crew of 38 people behind a perimeter fence. They've been collecting data on the outbreak since midnight, and they've reached similar conclusions about the organism's thermal vulnerability, but they don't have the synthesis pathway for the prophylactic. He held up the backpack containing Nina's data. They need what we have. And they're also in contact with FEMA and the National Guard. There are staging areas being established at 3 points outside the metro area. The response exists, Marcus. It's fragmented and overwhelmed, but it exists. For the first time in hours. For the first time since Nina Vasquez climbed into the back seat of my car, soaked in rain and terror, I felt something unclench in my chest. Not hope, exactly. Something more fundamental. The confirmation that we were not the last. That somewhere beyond the fires and the silence, people were still organizing, still fighting, still refusing to let the machinery of civilization stall entirely. Sophie's voice crackled over the security vehicle's radio. Ray had figured out the frequency. Dad says the truck is overheating. Can we stop? We pulled into the parking lot of a hardware store called Granby's, closed and dark, with a hand-lettered sign in the window that read, "Back in 10 minutes." The owner had expected to return. That mundane optimism lodged in my throat. Ray popped the hood of the security vehicle and diagnosed the problem in seconds, a coolant leak from a cracked hose. He was already scanning the hardware store's exterior, calculating whether breaking in was worth the supplies it might yield. When Sophie spotted them, 3 people, walking toward us from the tree line behind the store. Walking, not shambling. No visible fungal growth. They moved with purpose and awareness. And the one in front, a tall woman with a hunting rifle slung over her shoulder, raised a hand in the universal gesture of non-threatening approach. I stepped forward. Gloria stepped beside me. Behind us, Oren stayed in the car with Nina. And Ray positioned himself near Sophie with the fire axe resting casually against his leg. The woman reached us. She was late 30s, weathered, wearing jeans and a flannel shirt streaked with dried mud. The 2 behind her were younger, a man in his 20s carrying a duffel bag, and a woman of similar age with a paramedic's kit over her shoulder. "I'm Jean Alcott," the tall woman said. "We've been holed up in the farm supply warehouse about a mile north. There are 11 of us. We saw your headlights and took a chance." Marcus Dunn. "We're heading to Hadley Federal Research Center. We have information about the outbreak. How to fight it." Jean absorbed this with the stillness of someone who'd spent the night weighing every statement for survival value. Her eyes moved from me to Gloria, to the car where Oren and Nina sat, assessing, calculating. Fight it how? I gave her the short version. Engineered organism, thermal vulnerability, chemical prophylactic, data that needed to reach Hadley so it could be synthesized and distributed. Jean listened without interruption, her expression unreadable. And when I finished, she asked one question. "Can your doctor prove it?" Oren emerged from the car. He was carrying his tablet, and on it he had photographs. The slide preparations from Nina's samples, the before and after images of the organism's thermal degradation, the waveform analysis of the subsonic communication signal. He showed Jean. He showed the man and the paramedic. He explained the mechanism with the precise, accessible clarity of someone who'd spent a career translating complex science for non-specialist audiences. Jean looked at the paramedic. "Reese?" The paramedic, Reese, studied the tablet images. "The thermal destabilization is consistent with what we've observed. We had a colonized individual in our group early on, Miguel Ferrer. He spiked a 40-degree fever from an unrelated infection, and the fungal growth on his arm started dying within an hour. We didn't understand why at the time." "Is he alive?" Oren asked. "He is. Disoriented, weak, but cognitive. The growth died and sloughed off like dead skin." Oren turned to me, and the expression on his face was something I'll never forget. It was the expression of a scientist watching a hypothesis survive contact with independent, uncontrolled data. It was confirmation. The protocol worked not just in the artificial conditions of St. Clement's superheated corridors, but in the chaotic, uncontrolled reality of the field. Heat killed the organism. People survived. Jean made a decision with the efficiency of a woman accustomed to leadership, born from competence rather than authority. We have 2 working vehicles. I'll take 4 of my people and follow you to Hadley. The rest stay at the warehouse. It's defensible, and they have supplies for a week. We formed a 3-vehicle convoy. My Hyundai in front, Jean's pickup behind, Ray's security vehicle bringing up the rear, its coolant leak patched with epoxy and a strip of rubber from the hardware store's outdoor display that Ray acquired by reaching through a broken window with an apologetic expression. Sophie had migrated to my back seat, sharing the space with Nina, who was awake enough now to answer Sophie's questions about what the organism actually was and how it worked. Sophie absorbed the information the way her generation absorbed everything. Rapidly, critically, with a native fluency for processing threats to their world that older generations lacked. 14 miles to Hadley. The road opened into farmland. The sky was brightening, and for the first time, I could see the landscape. In true color, green fields, brown fences, the skeletal trees of early spring. It looked unchanged, untouched, as if the parasite were a purely urban phenomenon, confined to the density it needed to propagate. But I knew better. I'd seen the bodies on the sidewalks, the empty patrol cars, the church parking lot where colonized individuals stood motionless like congregants awaiting a sermon that would never come. The countryside's apparent normality was a function of distance and dispersal, not immunity. At mile 22, the Hadley Federal Research Center appeared on the horizon, a cluster of low white buildings behind a chain-link perimeter fence topped with concertina wire. Military vehicles were parked at the gate. Actual soldiers, in actual uniforms, stood at a checkpoint with actual protocols. I stopped the car and rolled down my window, and a National Guard sergeant with a clipboard approached. "Facility is restricted. State your purpose." "My name is Marcus Dunn. I have Dr. Oren Cabrera and Dr. Nina Vasquez in the vehicle. They have complete data on the organism responsible for the outbreak, including a thermal neutralization protocol and the synthesis pathway for a chemical prophylactic. Dr. Linda Tsao is expecting us." The sergeant looked at his clipboard, looked at us, lifted his radio. "Gate to command. I have a civilian convoy, 3 vehicles, claiming to carry research personnel with outbreak data. One of them says Tsao is expecting them." A pause, static, then a voice. "Confirmed. Escort them to Building 7. Dr. Tsao is en route." The gate opened. We drove through, and behind us, the gate closed, and I realized I was gripping the steering wheel so hard that my fingers were numb. We were inside. We'd made it. The data. Nina's stolen files, Oren's analysis, the proof that this organism could be beaten with heat and chemistry, was about to be placed in the hands of people who could act on it at scale. I parked the car. I turned off the engine. I sat there for a moment, in the driver's seat of my leased Hyundai Sonata, in the parking lot of a federal research facility, while the sun rose over a world that would never be the same. And I let my hands shake. Building 7 was a laboratory complex with more security doors than a bank vault, and air filtration systems that hummed with a low-frequency authority that made Oren's eyes light up. Dr. Linda Tsao met us in the lobby, a compact, silver-haired woman with a commanding presence that filled the sterile corridor like a broadcast signal. She took one look at Nina, assessed her condition with a clinician's glance, and directed a medic to escort her to the infirmary. Then she turned to Oren. "Show me everything." They disappeared into the lab, Gloria went with them. Her clinical expertise made her invaluable in the data triage process, and she shed her exhaustion like a discarded coat the moment she had a clearly defined role. Ray and Sophie were directed to a dormitory area where evacuees were being housed. Before he left, Ray shook my hand with the grip of a man who builds things for a living, and the eyes of a man who'd nearly lost everything. "You drive a good car, Marcus. It's a lease." He smiled. It was the first genuine smile I'd seen in 12 hours. Gene Alcott's people integrated into the facility's civilian population with the seamless efficiency of survivors who understood that adaptation was not optional. Jeanne herself joined the perimeter security team, her hunting rifle and practical competence earning her immediate credibility among the guardsmen who'd been holding the fence since midnight. I was left alone in the lobby of Building 7, standing under fluorescent lights that were powered by actual generators maintained by actual technicians. Surrounded by the sounds of actual organized human response, radio chatter, footsteps, the clink of equipment being moved with purpose, and I realized I had nothing to do. My role was over. I was the delivery mechanism, the Uber driver who'd accepted a fare and driven it to its destination through the end of the world. The surge pricing on my app, I suspected, would never be collected. I found a chair. I sat down. A young soldier offered me a bottle of water and a granola bar, and I accepted both with a gratitude so overwhelming that I had to look away from his face to keep my composure. I ate the granola bar in small bites and drank the water in measured sips and listened to the sounds of a species refusing to capitulate. 3 hours later, Oren emerged from the lab. He looked 10 years older but moved with an energy that contradicted his appearance. He sat beside me and spoke without preamble. "The synthesis is underway. They have the equipment and the reagents. First batch of CR7 will be ready in 18 hours. SAO has already transmitted the thermal protocol to every FEMA staging area and military installation in the region. Within 48 hours, coordinated thermal purge operations will begin in every major urban center." He paused. Nina's data also contained something we didn't expect. The organism's engineering specifications include a designed obsolescence, a genetic time limit built into the reproductive cycle. Meridian intended for the organism to be deployable, but not permanent. Without sustained chemical support from the lab, the organism's ability to produce viable spores degrades over a 14-day cycle. It dies on its own. It weakens, becomes non-viable for new colonization. The existing hosts would still need thermal treatment, but the airborne transmission vector would collapse within 2 weeks. He removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. They built an expiration date into their weapon. The one ethical consideration they implemented, likely for their own safety, may be what saves us. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling. 2 weeks. If we could survive 2 weeks. Protecting the uninfected, treating the colonized with heat and CR7, maintaining enough social infrastructure to keep people alive and organized. The organism would burn itself out. It wasn't a victory. It was a reprieve. Purchased with stolen data and a steamfitter's knowledge of boiler systems, and a ride-share driver who was $38 short of rent. Nina was released from the infirmary that afternoon. The organism was dead in her system, confirmed by 3 separate blood draws and a tissue biopsy that showed no viable mycelial activity. She walked into the lobby where I was still sitting, still processing, still holding the empty water bottle like a talisman. She looked fragile but upright. She looked like someone who had walked through her own death and come out the other side, carrying the weight of what she'd helped create and what she'd helped destroy. She sat beside me. We said nothing for a long time. Then she spoke. "Thank you for not pulling over. You were crying. I don't leave crying people on dark streets." That's a good policy. It's the only one I've got. Outside, the sun was high, and the sky was clear, and the National Guard was loading CR7 synthesis equipment onto transport vehicles. And somewhere in the distance, a helicopter crossed the horizon, heading toward the city. I think about the fare sometimes. The 3.2 times surge. The $38 I needed for rent. The algorithm that sent me to a warehouse district at 11:47 p.m. and connected me with a woman carrying the blueprint to an apocalypse and its cure in the same messenger bag. I think about what would have happened if I'd declined the ride. If I'd been 1 minute slower, 1 block further away. If my rating had been lower or my acceptance rate had dropped below the threshold that kept me in the surge zone. The margin between the world ending and the world surviving was a gig worker's desperation and a $10 surge bonus. I don't drive for Uber anymore. There's not much demand for rideshare in a city that's still rebuilding its traffic lights. I work at Hadley now, on the logistics team that coordinates CR7 distribution to treatment centers in the recovery zone. It's not glamorous. It's spreadsheets and supply chains and radio calls to field teams who need more vials or more propane for the portable heating units. But it's necessary. And it's mine. And for the first time since the hospital restructured and handed me a cardboard box, I feel like I'm doing something that matters. Nina and I don't talk about that night. We don't need to. We were there. We survived. That's the whole story.